What's going on with celebrities? Is literally everyone you've ever heard of going to commit sexual assault, or sign their name on a bomb, or drag their partner through a hideous court case, or commit sexual assault, or start a cult, or go on an anti-Semitic rant, or an Islamophobic rant, or a transphobic rant, or commit sexual assault? Should we just give up on having heroes? Celebrities seem, and this is just me testing the air and feeling the vibe, to have moved past their fame being contingent on a good persona. There seems to be an audience for monsters, and a system which does not discriminate against monsters. And sometimes this even happens with someone you really love. Sometimes you're witnessing the falling from grace of an artist you really respect. We all know that feeling of seeing on the news, oh, that guy, I love that guy. He did what? To how many women? And you go through a whole process of maybe being dubious, and then sad, and then angry, and then I don't know quite what we do. I'm not sure that anyone else does either. It's tempting to say that after the anger comes acceptance of this person's wrongdoing. But acceptance sounds an awful lot like complacency. And I don't want to be complacent about the wrongdoing of these rich and famous abusers. But does that mean that I have a moral responsibility to stay angry forever? When one of our beloved celebrities turns out to be a piece of shit, surely we can imagine better tools for dealing with that than just cancelling them, or saying, oh, well, there goes another one, or pretending to have never liked them in the first place. So yeah, we're gonna talk about Neil Gaiman. I'm very sad about Neil Gaiman, and he didn't even do anything to me. I'd like to go on a bit of a journey with my heavily pregnant co-creator, where I figure out what to do when a hero turns out to be a monster, what to do with all of the love and respect I had for Neil Gaiman, what to do with all of the anger and grief I have over Neil Gaiman, what to do with Neil Gaiman. If you want the short journey, just skip to
1 hour, 19 minutes, 14 seconds.
I sum it up in like a few sentences. For the more scenic journey, well, this is clearly bigger than Neil Gaiman. It's bigger than any of these individual monsters. There's something weird going on with our entire dysfunctional celebrity ecosystem, our entire parasocial culture, all of which are words that it might be helpful to know what they mean, because we don't know what those words mean. So f*** Neil Gaiman, and there'll be plenty of f*** Neil Gaiman to come, and it seems like f*** Neil Gaiman is really the order of the day. Something people need to hear right now. Did you hear about Neil Gaiman? Yeah, f*** Neil Gaiman, you'll see. But also, hi, I'm Neil, and I love Neil Gaiman. So, yeah. For those who don't know, Neil Gaiman is a British author and cultural icon whose parents were professional Scientologists but also Jewish, and he wrote a lot of books and screenplays and comics and things. Look at all these adaptations. You've probably seen a bunch of these adaptations. And he's been on The Simpsons twice, and he's got floppy hair, and he's friends with Alan Moore and Terry Pratchett, and his ex-wife is singer-songwriter Amanda Palmer, and I don't know, he's Neil Gaiman. He's a British wit who's so accessible that even Americans like him. He wrote the now legendary Sandman series for DC/Vertigo, as well as the comics Whatever Happened to the Caped Crusader and Coraline. He also co-wrote Good Omens with Sir Terry, in addition to his own popular contemporary novels, American Gods, Anansi Boys, and others, adopting a blend of gothic horror, low fantasy, and wit, resulting in a unique yet hyper-commercial prose that sounds like this. Fat Charlie was thirsty. Fat Charlie was thirsty and his head hurt. Fat Charlie was thirsty and his head hurt and his mouth tasted evil and his eyes were too tight in his head and all his teeth twinged and his stomach burned and his back was aching in a way that started around his knees and went up to his forehead and his brains had been removed and replaced with cotton balls and needles and pins, which was why it hurt to try and think. And his eyes were not just too tight in his head, but they must have rolled out in the night and been reattached with roofing nails. And now he noticed that anything louder than the gentle Brownian motion of air molecules drifting softly past each other was above his pain threshold. Also, he wished he were dead, which is how British people say, Fat Charlie was hungover. Neil Gaiman is my favourite living author.
In July 2024, an investigation by Tortoise Media reported allegations by 2 women of sexual misconduct against Gaiman, including sexual abuse and coercive behaviour.
Following initial investigation in July, 3 more women come forward, including one who signed NDA following her experience with author.
5 women have accused the Sandman writer Neil Gaiman of sexual assault.
The podcast, Master, the allegations against Neil Gaiman, shares the stories of 4 women who allege he sexually assaulted them in 1986 and 2022, respectively. Another woman appeared on a separate podcast with an allegation relating to 2012.
One woman alleged that Gaiman performed sexual acts on her without her consent when she was working as a nanny for the author's family in New Zealand.
Caroline Wallner, who alleged that Gaiman pressured her to have sex with him in return for letting her live at his property in upstate New York, and made her sign a non-disclosure agreement in return for a $275,000 payment.
Kay told Tortoise Media that she had rough and painful sex with Gaiman that she neither wanted nor enjoyed. She also claimed that Gaiman had sex with her while she had an infection, despite her asking him not to.
Scarlett's account is that after they eat the pizza together outside, Gaiman offers to run her a bath.
According to Scarlett, Gaiman runs the bath.
Then he comes down to the bath naked and gets in. Scarlett remembers his nonchalance is disarming, that she is shocked and bewildered, and makes her wonder if it's normal.
She knows Palmer has a liberal attitude towards nudity, so has that as a framing context.
Scarlett doesn't get out of the bath when Gaiman gets in, but draws up her legs. She remembers being scared. What follows is an account of assault.
Scarlett says that Gaiman pressured her to put down her legs, that he digitally penetrated her without consent. She tells the podcast that is the last thing on the planet she'd ever want to do.
She also says that Gaiman jerked off on her and said filthy things and ordered her to call him master.
Claire said that before the event, she told Mr. Gaiman that she did not want to have sex with him.
He reassured me that I didn't have to worry and that I was under no obligation to do anything I didn't want to do,
Claire said.
After the event, Mr. Gaiman took Claire to a room on a tour bus and began to kiss and grope her without her consent. Consent is not what happened between me and Neil, Claire told The Times about that encounter.
The victim alleged to Tortoise that while the author was on a book tour in the US in July 2013, he took her to a room in his tour bus with a bed, closed the door, got on top of her, kissed her, and groped her under her dress and over her breasts.
Claire said that nearly a decade later, in June 2022, she wrote a letter to Mr. Gaiman to confront him. After she wrote him the letter, they had 2 phone calls, she said. During the second call, Mr. Gaiman offered Claire $60,000 to be paid over 4 years, she said.
In the recording of the phone call, the man is heard telling Claire,
I'm feeling that I got the wrong end of the stick. I was heartbroken seeing you, that I had given you nightmares. I'm really sorry. I'm trying to make up for some of the damage. Would you like me to send you some money?
In August 2022, Claire said she woke up one morning and saw that $60,000 had been deposited into her bank account.
I recognize now that the money was hush money, she said.
Gaiman has strongly denied any unlawful conduct.
According to Claire, the author said that she kissed him first, but she refuted his claim.
I said, no, that's not actually true. You kissed me first, 10 minutes after meeting me.
And then he brought his autism diagnosis into it as something of an explanation for why he wasn't able to read my body language.
Gaiman's position is that he strongly denies any allegations of non-consensual sex with the women, and adds New Zealand police
did not take up his offer of assistance over one woman's complaint in 2022, which he says reflects its lack of substance.
However, New Zealand police said it made a number of attempts to speak to key people as part of this investigation, and those efforts remain ongoing.
In response to Scarlett's allegations, Gaiman told Tortoise Media that he believes her claims stem from a medical condition related to false memories.
Tortoise understands that he believes Kay's allegations are motivated by her regret over their relationship, and that Scarlett was suffering from a condition associated with false memories at the time of her relationship with him. A claim which is not supported by her medical records and medical history.
It's horrible. Oh, and it's you, that guy. I've seen you in our comments before, coming over to say, these are just accusations, or can't a guy sexually assault someone in a bus without getting cancelled these days? Why are you here? So many things are made especially for you. There are so many podcasts you could be listening to, with big, loud men loudly talking over one another. Go watch a We're in Hell video. So Neil Gaiman sexually assaulted multiple women over decades. And when the excuse that, no I didn't work, he tried, I misread the situation, I have autism, ooh. And when that didn't work, he tried, well here, have tens of thousands of pounds. And when that didn't work, since you can't beat a classic, he tried, well, she is kinda crazy. And honestly, it makes me feel gross, having just said 3 minutes ago, Neil Gaiman is my favorite living author, which is a thing I did and I won't be denying. But what am I gonna do? Yell at Neil Gaiman's face in the clouds so you can all get a sense of secondhand catharsis? My therapist says I shouldn't do that anymore. It's not doing anything. I mean, on the one hand, it's not doing anything for me, for emotionally processing that a celebrity I love turns out to be a monster. And on the other hand, it's not doing anything to change the world either, which still produces these people with their elevated status and the power to abuse that goes along with it. An ecosystem has emerged off the back of getting angry at celebrities and getting angry at people getting angry at celebrities, and indeed becoming celebrities by getting angry at people getting angry at celebrities. There are some who call this cancel culture, but the people who call it that are probably the last ones you should listen to about it. Now, there are answerable questions. There have been good studies and there's even been good analysis. And yet there's still a lot missing from this conversation. Not least because the idea that an audience consumes and worships a celebrity figure is kind of outdated. Increasingly, these relationships are not one-sided. A growing number of people find themselves in the middle, or networked in some other fashion, in some complicated figure fandom dynamic. Most of us living now have some kind of online existence with personas and all that that entails. What's your 6 degrees of separation from your nearest celebrity? One time, Mike Scott from the Waterboys yelled at me on Twitter in a loving way, like a do better way, and then he unfollowed me. Like, we've definitely developed some norms and some instinct and certainly some anxieties around how to navigate this digital world, but it tends to be things like subscribers saying, I don't want to be parasocial or anything, which is sort of the digital equivalent of saying, no offense. Like, you are being parasocial. That's how this works. So creators are just as bad. They'll say things like, I don't want to create a parasocial dynamic with my audience. To which I'm like, okay, how does that work? Are you going to be like Thomas Pynchon? It seems that the norms and the instincts and the anxieties are the things governing how we react when we learn something awful that a public figure has done. And that could be dangerous, because if we identify with that fandom, for example, it might not matter what we learn about X celebrity, we'll defend them as if we're defending ourselves. What I'm saying is that at the heart of this is some issue with how we understand social dynamics, parasocial or otherwise. And that's what I actually need to figure out if I want to have a healthier relationship with the Neil Gaiman books on my shelf. Because bearing in mind that without parasocial dynamics, Neil Gaiman would not have been able to do or get away with so much harm, well, we kind of need to understand those dynamics, don't we?
I hate celebrity culture. And no, that's not because I'm more interesting or enlightened. It's because I have face blindness and I don't know who anyone is. So I really only hear about celebrities in 2 contexts. One is a friend doing their best to explain to me who someone is and who they played and who they performed alongside, and I completely zone out while Dark Star from the Grateful Dead plays in my head. Or I hear about the latest terrible scandal from someone like Neil Gaiman, and then I wish I still didn't know who that person was. And look, I do understand intellectually how celebrity culture is supposed to work. Let's say you're in an office and you only vaguely know your coworkers and you're waiting for the capsule coffee machine to finish making your sad, watery masala chai when a coworker that you don't know comes up to queue for the machine. And I know some people like silence, but some people don't. Some people like me think the phrase comfortable silence is an oxymoron, so people like me need something to talk about. And yeah, you can talk about the weather twice, maybe 3 times, but if you've talked to the same coworker a few times already, endlessly discussing the weather will mean that now you are the reason that it sucks to queue for coffee. So you can't have a real conversation, but you do need to go a bit deeper. So did you see that thing Chappell Roan did last week? Oh my gosh, can you even believe it? Whether I like it or not, celebrities serve a social function. As topics of conversation go, politics might be explosive, our own special interests might be too niche or boring, but most people do know the current discourse around a celebrity.
Celebrity knowledge becomes a sort of social capital that we can trade to get out of otherwise awkward scenarios, or as a proxy to discuss more divisive issues without speaking about real people. Because while the person playing Chapel Roan exists, we actually aren't really talking about her. We don't know her. It's kind of gross to gossip about the misfortunes of real people. But as a symbol, she becomes a conduit to discuss bigger issues. It may be through a conversation about a celebrity that you learn the person you're talking to has similar life philosophies to you. It may be the way through which you begin to form a friendship. But for a lot of people, a lot of times, celebrity culture goes even deeper. They can go beyond just social lubrication. Celebrities become someone we see ourselves in. People we look up to and want to emulate. People who seem to struggle the way we struggle. People who put words to things we feel but can't discuss. They become comforting beacons as we navigate reality, and in that way, they become a part of our identity. I am in this celebrity fandom. This is a part of who I am. Some academics have begun researching these parasocial relationships. In one study, participants were asked to imagine that their favorite creator had committed a moral violation, like abusing a puppy. And then they were asked about the impact on their creator's career and on their feelings towards the creator. And the results were really interesting. Even in this hypothetical scenario, some participants just refused to believe their favorite celebrity would commit harm, saying things like, well, people would know she didn't do it on purpose. Other participants argued that maybe there would be some initial blowback, but that the public opinion would move on quickly.
I would assume that a lot of people would react poorly and call the creator out on their actions and start to unfollow them. There will be some people who defend them no matter what and continue to follow them. The creator will come out with an apology video that will probably fan the flames for a while. After about 2 weeks, everyone will probably forget and never talk about it again. Ultimately, the creator will come out of the scandal relatively unscathed.
Which feels depressingly accurate to me. But others vowed to go hard on their creator, to have what the literature calls a parasocial breakup, because it turns out that ending a parasocial relationship causes us emotional distress. And many people in the study did vow to break up with their influencer, canceling Patreon pledges, unfollowing them, no longer watching or engaging with their content. But interestingly, the study found that even for those committed to a breakup, the strength of their parasocial relationship or their emotional connection to their influencer, that didn't decrease significantly. They could imagine themselves being angry. They could imagine themselves never engaging with the celebrity again, but their feelings of identification and investment and connection with their creator, those didn't decrease, which is kind of like what happens with a real breakup. The point where you've recovered is not the point where you're sitting in your bedroom stewing and thinking about all the bad things that you want to happen to your ex. The point at which you've recovered is the point where you're not thinking about them anymore. But this is where celebrity relationships differ from personal ones. Ending a relationship in your personal life usually means severing any power dynamics. Celebrities, though, they continue to exist in the periphery. Most of them are uncancelable, and most of them still have the power to continue to hurt and abuse others, while we just sit and watch. The situation it mirrors most in our personal lives isn't a normal breakup, but an abusive one, where you are unable to fully sever ties and protect yourself from being hurt, even if that hurt is in just watching the celebrity continue to hurt others.
So Neil Gaiman and I have decided to break up. Well, actually, as a fan, I decided to break up with him because as a person, he decided to be a complete piece of fucking shit, didn't he? Hey, editing Neil here. Hi. And like me, you've probably broken up with one or two of your heroes before, and we shouldn't let that bring us down, okay? We should just spend a little time in our safe place, eating our safe chocolate, and find a new hero. Or we can just give up on people entirely. As I imagine some of you have experienced before, it is quite difficult to only give up on famous people. Like, who is that? Should we include everyone who's ever written a book, every historical figure, every YouTuber, everyone in politics? Len Penny, The guy from Hot Ones? The lads from King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard? Do we give up on fictional people? I mean, I thought Aragorn was pretty cool, but I think he genocided the orcs. And I know it's old news, but like, who the f*** are these people? These weird, bulked up sociopaths delivering bad Judd Apatow dialogue to each other in front of a green screen, clearly serving as propaganda for an empire that has no idea what it's even supposed to represent anymore. I used to be kind of attached to one or two of them. What was I thinking? But I also don't know anyone that doesn't have some pantheon of characters in their head, real or fictional, that represents, to them, admirable, cool, heroic, imitable traits. I don't know anyone that doesn't have heroes. Sure, I know people who are disconnected from, like, modern culture, but that's just a taste thing. That doesn't correlate with them being a good person or having strong ethics. People who are obsessed with 1970s musicians or early 20th century political thinkers are just as capable of willfully blinding themselves to the dark side of those heroes. Fandom corrupts. But this is not a clear picture. These terms, fandom, celebrity, hero, we can't throw these around willy-nilly. If I'm going to get back on the horse and find new heroes, I'm going to need a fashion montage. Okay. The Madonna. See, when I say celebrity culture, I'm talking about the contemporary Western phenomenon where there is constant coverage and voyeuristic insight into the private lives of weird, smiley, strong-jawed Hollywood types, and also the phenomenon in which marketing companies weaponize our fascination with these people to sell us coffee from that guy, and perfume from that woman, and cat food from the guy that used to be in Take That. The American fascination with the socialite scene, how the elites are dressed and what parties they're going to and who they're fucking, is as old as America itself. But 80s pop sensation Madonna is credited by many scholars as changing the nature of popular culture, from one where paparazzi and gossip columnists were in a predatory relationship with actors, singers, artists, and elites, to one of symbiosis, in which the celebrity invites scrutiny and exposure and voyeurism. Madonna was so balls-out honest about every gritty detail of her personal life that her celebrity overtook her music. The vlogger. In the digital age which followed in the wake of this celebrity culture, where celebrity was an action one could do, the lifestyle vlogger emerged as someone dealing entirely in the action of authenticity. Part voyeurism, part entertainment, part wish fulfillment. Homemade content chronicling middle-class lives became a phenomenon not just of its own, but one which bled into reality TV, the modern celebrity interview, and as a collective audience, our general expectations about what authenticity looks like. The concept of a celebrity in such an ecosystem became very abstract, very postmodern, such that now we have to be careful about how we interpret this word celebrity. We can interpret it in a classical way, where it's people who act in films or who have Billboard Top 100 song albums or whatever. It's people who are wealthy and who work in glamour industries. But also, we can interpret celebrity as an impossibly complicated fractal network of people who compose fandoms. And we could quibble about who counts and who doesn't, but that won't get you a definition. The defining factor here is not how well known, it is how the network of fans orbit the cultural object. The nerd. I've got my sociology hat on for this one. This hat. I look bad in hats. When we refer to literal fandoms, subcultures that emerge around a common interest, that common interest might be a person and it might not. Regardless, it is a cultural object. A very obvious example is the cultural object of Star Trek and the fandom of Trekkies. A less obvious example is the cultural object of Zoe B and the fandom of Busbies. Fandom is a broad social phenomenon. People, when they share a common interest, organize themselves around something and, to give a circular definition, behave like fans, even if that common interest doesn't necessarily resemble nerd culture. So, for example, stanning politicians. I will not be defining stanning. I do not possess the appropriate hat. I'm just trying to lay the groundwork for an argument that we as a society seem to be interacting with multiple spheres as if they are fandoms. After all, there has to be some reason why we've decided that we need the term stanning. Better reason than just the existence of a song that Eminem released 24 years ago? This paper out of Finland characterizes 3 different ways that we engage with fandoms. 1, other-directed. That's your popular thing. Maybe it's a fad or fashion. Your engagement is an attempt to connect with others, to have something to talk about. These are still things that we can get really into, engage with at the level of fan, but they're other-directed. 2, self-directed. This fandom interaction is likely to be with something more subcultural and specific. It's a personal kind of engagement. That's Sarah being a deadhead. That's me being really into the Sandman comics. That's you and your dirty, filthy little cartoons that you like to dress up as, or whatever. What this paper shows is that the skills people learn by engaging in an other-directed popular fandom can be decontextualized and recontextualized in a self-directed personal fandom. Kind of like how if you learn piano, it's easier to learn other instruments, even if those instruments have strings instead of keys. So if you, as a kid, for example, memorized all 151 first-generation Pokemon, who would do such a thing? Then you can't really transfer that skill directly into other fandoms, I've tried, but you can transfer the methodology, the principle of it, and the confidence that you can memorize stuff like that. The paper presents this as the 3rd way of engaging with fandom, transcending fandom. We can not only apply our new skills to a more personal fandom beyond Pokemon or Star Trek or whatever, but beyond the field of fandom itself and into the broader world.
Michael had been able, through his Harry Potter fandom, to construct an identity that was more creative and confident than his former or real one. He eventually began asserting that creativity and confidence in aspects of his everyday life. He took up new hobbies, such as dancing and theater, which he finds to be extremely cool, but which he had previously been too shy to engage in. Eventually, he was able to manifest a creative identity in his more generalized life context, building friendships and asserting himself through his new identity by finding in his everyday life similar types of sources of creativity he had within fandom. And in fact, he had decontextualized the more creative and confident identity with its self-representation and associated behaviors from Harry Potter and recontextualized it within the realms of dance and theater, where fandom was not a prerequisite for acceptance or status.
And maybe you've had something like Michael's experience. I know I have. I definitely find that the field-specific skills I've accrued as a nerd, whether that's getting into comic books or music or video essays, have all applied in a surprising variety of areas that allow me to feel more fulfilled and, in a sense, bigger, more like me in my identity. To quote the paper again,
we show how individuals can learn to deal with the simultaneously debilitating and empowering freedom of contemporary culture by learning how to maneuver within it. Individuals thus embrace a malleable identity by learning how to adapt within their ever-changing cultural context.
Okay, but we can't really do justice to any of this without understanding the actual social forces that are being measured. So, and I'm so sorry for this, the angry Marxist. You can't talk about accruing cultural skills, transcending field-specific limitations or whatever, and have it make any sense without talking about, well, actually it's worse than just talking about Marxism. We're going to talk about cultural capital. Is it bougie to do a fashion montage to explain like Marxist theory? None of my clothes are new, by the way. The guy who first came up with this term cultural capital was Pierre Bourdieu. You probably know him from better video essays. He's actually a great thinker to turn to for those sorts of ridiculous worries like, is this bougie? Genuinely, if you're sincerely asking, is this pretentious? Am I doing a class treachery right now? And so on. Because to really paraphrase Pierre Bourdieu, he wanted to know why come some shit is fancy? Why is opera generally considered an art form for the wealthy? Why do Tom Wamsgans and Cousin Greg eat the tiny bird with napkins on their heads? And, why do experts in global politics always look like this? What's the deal with certain kinds of authority having certain aesthetics and vibes? Or, to paraphrase him less half-assedly, how are social hierarchies reproduced when they're not just emerging from literal material accumulation of capital? So he came up with this idea of cultural capital. And through that idea, he ends up with this whole conceptual framework that scholars have been using since to understand the role of cultural resources in reproducing hierarchy. How wealth culture, working class culture, social strata all compose the capitalist hierarchy we all know and love and hate. In his own words,
The notion of cultural capital initially presented itself to me in the course of research as a theoretical hypothesis, which made it possible to explain the unequal scholastic achievement of children originating from the different social classes by relating academic success.
Basically, he asked, how did rich kids actually have an advantage when you can't literally buy better grades? At least you couldn't in France in the 80s. Very progressive place. Bourdieu broke down cultural capital into 3 states that it can exist in. The institutionalized state, which is when an institution recognizes a person as having some authority or qualification or some institutional honor of some other kind, which can then be transferred into an economic asset. So yeah, doctors, lawyers, academics, but also, like in Britain, they're super transparent about this. It's its own silly abstract. They get all excited when the local baron comes to give a speech and turn on the Christmas lights and kick the poor in the head or whatever. Oh, this person is very important. We'd better give him a castle. Why is he so important? Well, because he lives in a castle. But it is manifest in American culture also through, amongst other things, celebrity. Stand on the sideline of the red carpet and say to yourself, oh my God, I can't believe I might get a picture of someone so important. Then there's the objectified state of cultural capital, which is what it sounds like. It's capital transformed into powerful objects. What are the sort of objects we get power from? Well, they are our tools, our instruments, our computers and our guns and even our books or our opera tickets. A person who has the knowledge to use such objects can transfer that use and knowledge value into literal cash, gold. But of course, none of this would make any sense without that third kind, the embodied state of cultural capital, which is embodying stuff, having a certain accent and a certain demeanor and a certain handshake and knowing stuff, knowing how stuff works, running the gamut from the quite obvious, like being educated in science or law, to the less obvious stuff like knowing how a rich person spends money, how a rich person doesn't spend money, knowing how to speak a foreign language, knowing the secret nicknames of the people in the Garrick Club, like Billy Big Balls or Benny Dick Brain. Right, well, that's all very interesting. Just a quick vibe check, though. How many of you are like, why aren't you talking about Neil Gaiman? Talk about Neil Gaiman. Restate the crimes, the endless list of things. Remember, you can always skip
1 hour, 19 minutes, 14 seconds.
For the rest of us, Bourdieu's post-Marxist analysis helps in understanding where the power that can be abused actually comes from. Because while Gaiman did have the literal cash money to pay off certain of the women he hurt, he also had this more abstract power over them. The scholars that came after Marx were trying to understand an economy composed of more than just steel mills. And Pierre Bourdieu in particular was trying to understand an economics composed of more than just the economy. So he had this pretty solid idea that rich people accumulate capital, and therefore power, in their very culture. And then what happened is this thing called the 2000s. The 2000s. So on the one hand, thinkers could expand Bourdieu's theory and understand whiteness, for example, as an embodied form of cultural capital, or information technology as an objectified form of cultural capital, or even having a big Twitter following as an institutionalized form of cultural capital. But at that point, some of the confusing complexity of modern culture has entered the picture. The simplest and shortest way to put it is that in the modern cultural arena, we have made the rules of class nearly indecipherable. And there's no way to give you a full overview of that, but I can give you bits. People value purchasing nice things, like handcrafted leather-bound pencil sharpeners, without that necessarily reflecting class. Or they become like self-proclaimed experts on cinema by watching A24 films, without that necessarily reflecting class. Or they get really into beer. Or they spend longer in the museum than you might expect, given the income level of their parents. As the middle class shrinks in the global north and generations become materially poorer than their parents, oddly, commensurately, the signifiers of class become more cryptic and turn into empty references for the lols. People are, generally, messing around with the signifiers of class quite freely and haphazardly. And who could blame them? None of us are climbing the social ladder any other way. Now, you can imagine that this might complicate the concept of fandom, because on the one hand, we have really disrupted the old way of evaluating what it means to have good taste. And on the other hand, fandom itself is this process of arranging ourselves around a cultural object. Fandom is collecting leather-bound pencil sharpeners and getting into all of the A24 films, right? Fandom transcends classical social arrangements. So let me quote from the conclusion of the paper from earlier.
Through examining identity construction and the resolution of identity ambiguity among serial fans of various consumption phenomena, this study finds that the accrual of cultural capital is a skill that can be learned in a field-specific context and then decontextualized to be employed more generally.
It would seem that sometimes modern people learn from fandoms how to be people, how to navigate the world, how to accrue cultural value. And you might react to that by saying, oh shit, that's bad. Is that bad? Is that why everything's so fucked? And I might ask you to just quiet that concern just for a moment. Yes, it is hard to uncouple fandom from consumer culture. Yes, a lot of the democratization of wealth signifiers, such that you can buy them from Temu, is dystopian. And yes, it is hard to uncouple celebrity culture from American supremacy and normative liberal politics, which include but are not limited to supporting an ongoing genocide in Gaza and putting Mexican children in cages. But if, as I am arguing, we're already decades deep in this phenomenon of people formulating their identity through fandom, more so than historical identity markers like parents' religion or nationality or even class, if that is an ongoing process, then we're not going to escape it by broadcasting our disgust and running away. We should try to understand it by recognizing that it makes up part of who we are right now, and that it may contain clues and hacks as to how to organize ourselves and consciousness raise outside of and beyond an imprisoning consumer and class structure. At which point I can admit to just being in love with parts of fandom culture. I like parts of this. I am touched by Michael's story, and I relate to other stories from the Finnish study. Discovering aspects of yourself in your heroes or in the art of your heroes, building a cocoon out of that, and then emerging like a butterfly, less shy, more vibrant, more interested in things, with more to say, and saying things that feel more like you, that's gorgeous. I don't know who I'd be without Eddie Izzard or Jim Henson or Terry Pratchett or, Neil Gaiman. So now I can give you my definition of hero. It is someone who, when you trip over them out there in the world, they feel like you, but better. They're important in a good way, powerful in a good way, superhumanly good at things you value. And then they either die a hero or live long enough to be disappointingly human. So often, especially in the case of famous men, they've been indulging in the spoils of power, traveling across the colonies, living in expensive buildings, eating nice food, taking good drugs, and sexually assaulting people. It just takes a breaking story like a podcast or some other brave whistleblowing to reveal how their power was spent. And then those of us with a conscience who thought we had picked a good hero scrabble around, trying to separate the art from the artist, trying to separate the artist from ourselves, so that there's something left of what they taught us about ourselves that we can still stand behind.
Hello, I'm Death, and would you like to play? Not Gaiman's Death and neither Bergman's game. It's Scrabble, see? The letters spell my name. N-E-I-L, which shares an author's shame. Neil Gaiman puts a lot of literary references into his work. From Shakespeare to Sophocles to H.P. Lovecraft to Chaucer to the Old Testament to the Norse Edda and so on. And behind all of that literary craftsmanship and edifice, it can be hard to see Neil himself. The way I like to put it is that he has his art blender level set very high, so that the parts that are made of him get very finely chopped and ground and lost in the overall blend. I picked up that particular turn of phrase from an essay by Gaiman's ex-wife, Amanda Palmer, someone who admits to having her own art blender set very low, so that huge chunks of her appear in almost everything she makes. And Sarah and I are very similar. There's very little that we make that doesn't have big chunks of us in it. Except, of course, I am not Neil, I'm Death, and Neil himself is dead to me at heart. I'm sick of wasting time and words and breath on Gaiman, so instead, here's Roland Barthes. Roland Barthes is a philosopher and literary theorist who wrote the now famous essay, The Death of the Author. See? I'm Death. I'm just as Death because this is an old, dead point that nobody wants to talk about anymore. Did you know that there's a way to interpret a text that completely disregards authorial intent? Yes? But there's something of particular note that's happened to Death of the Author as a concept, and it makes it worth revisiting. The meaning of this term seems to have drifted a little from the original essay. People seem to interpret Death of the Author as a distinction between an author's work and an author's personality. So it becomes a means by which we intellectualize and explain away the guilt of engaging with the work of people like J.K. Rowling or Graham Linehan or whatever other bastard. The author is dead to you. You're not promoting them or celebrating them. You're promoting or celebrating the worlds they created. You are claiming those worlds, in fact, for you and the fandom, and fuck the author. Now, that's not a wrong way to think about fiction. It's not even necessarily a wrong way to think about Death of the Author. But as I say, it shows some significant drift from the original essay. I mean, Roland Barthes would have to be a real hypocrite to be like, that wasn't what I meant. So what did he mean? I don't fucking know. But he arranged the words in a way that I can interpret as being a response to the era of literary criticism that came before, which focused almost entirely on the author and his mind and his life and his intent. Death of the Author is concerned with the possibility of words and poetry. It praises the sublime subjective dance between reader and text.
A text's unity lies not in its origin, but in its destination. To give a text an author is to impose a limit on that text, to furnish it with a final signified, to close the writing.
You guys ever listen to Animal Collective? This essay sees the author as this overshadowing dimension of a work, which collapses all other artistic possibility. So when Neil Gaiman says, for example, Maeve Livingston rode the lift up to the 5th floor alone, the slow, jerky journey giving her plenty of time to rehearse in her head what she would say to Graham Coates when she got there. She was carrying a slim brown briefcase, which had belonged to Morris, a peculiarly masculine object. Who thinks the briefcase is peculiarly masculine? Is it Maeve Livingston? Is it Neil Gaiman? Is it an objective fact from the view of the universe? This essay doesn't think that there's an answer to that question, and not only that, but if there were an answer, then this book and all books would be less good. The view of Neil Gaiman should disappear. His voice should become mine. He should die in committing his art to my experience.
In precisely this way, literature, by refusing to assign a secret and ultimate meaning to the text, liberates what may be called an anti-theological activity, an activity that is truly revolutionary, since to refuse to fix meaning is, in the end, to refuse God in his hypostases: reason, science, law. Boy, I hope it's pronounced hypostases.
So should we argue that Gaiman's work would be better without the Gaiman part? Well, we definitely could argue that. Interpretation is an activity. There should be no shoulds. What we can say is that the removal of the author transforms that activity. Maybe it could be useful for you as a creator. You get rid of your ego, surprise yourself, use more automatic processes, disregard your intentions and become the art. And then as an audience, our response to all these weird modern commercial artistic enterprises could be transformed by shedding the burden of author. Because modern art and media make such cynical components of authorship. This is a Steven Spielberg film. This is a Stephen King novel. And this is a Duffer Brothers, Stephen King, Steven Spielberg, Stephen sandwich. As audience, we have our ability to assess crowded out by this emphasis on brand. And Neil Gaiman is nothing if not a brand. Quite apart from all this evil shit that he did, Gaiman was already on his way to outliving his pristine artist status by virtue of becoming, like so many before him, a parody of himself. Disappointing adaptations, oversaturation, annoying ads on YouTube for Neil Gaiman Masterclass. The back of this copy of Anansi Boys is not a blurb. It's not even praise for the book. It's praise for the world of Neil Gaiman. It's endorsement of a brand. Gaiman was already dangerously close to becoming the thinking man's Tim Burton. Not that that process is peculiar to Neil Gaiman. Part of the process alienating me from my artistic heroes is their being cheapened, commodified, made into brands. The focus on their celebrity and status as author, all of which is the exact opposite of the pure vibes of my interaction with their art. And quite antithetical to the direction that Roland Barthes thought it was important for society and art to move in. Alan Moore, who I'm bringing up not because he appeared in his own annoying masterclass ads, nor because he is a personal friend of Neil Gaiman, but actually because this guy is still capable of shaking up our ideas of all of this nonsense. He's a renowned innovator in the medium of comic books and graphic novels. He wrote Watchmen and From Hell and The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, all of which he tried to guard against disappointing adaptations, with little success. And he spoke about this phenomenon of celebrity eclipsing art and how it relates to the deterioration of fandom scenes in general.
I detected the beginnings of a tendency to fetishize a work's creator rather than simply appreciate the work itself, as if artists and writers were themselves part of the costumed entertainment. Never having sought a pop celebrity relationship with readers, I withdrew by stages from the social side of comics, acquiring my standing as a furious, unfathomable hermit in the process.
Moore describes comic book fandom as becoming gentrified. Where once there was a thriving community of working-class outsiders in obscure basements, now there is a fandom industry of middle-aged and middle-class folks, those who can afford to participate in the hobby and whose domineering tactics have an adverse effect on the perception of the fandom. And of course there are those who would argue the exact opposite, that nerd culture has been disproportionately, perhaps in a nefarious and underhanded way, pushed towards identity politics, the queer and radicalized minorities that seem to have colonized fandom as if overnight. And those people are a very good example of a toxic fandom, the thing that Alan Moore is talking about.
I believe that fandom is a wonderful and vital organ of contemporary culture, without which that culture ultimately stagnates, atrophies, and dies. At the same time, I'm sure that fandom is sometimes a grotesque blight that poisons the society surrounding it with its mean-spirited obsessions and ridiculous, unearned sense of entitlement.
Fandom corrupts. You see, as much as it can be framed as quite lovely to have these parallel worlds for us outsiders where we can learn how to people, these fandom worlds are rife with problems. Through the mythologies and rules and methods of accruing social capital in a fandom, these communities can inherit some of the worst, ugly fictions from out here in the real world, and then not only repeat them, but amplify them, obsess over them, and socially police them. In Don't Mess With My Happy Place, Understanding Misogyny in Fandom Communities, author Gwendolyn S. Nisbet examined misogyny from the fan perspective by collecting qualitative interview responses from fans at Comic-Con. God help her. The results were pretty much exactly what you'd expect. Men reporting sexist attitudes towards women, women reporting bullying and harassment. The conclusion states,
this group of geek men, who are often marginalized themselves, are trying to hold on to and perpetuate their form of hypermasculinity by belittling and marginalizing female fans. While each fandom is different, with some being more offensive, the notion of women not fitting into the fandom because of a lack of fandom knowledge was the strongest and most persistent theme.
And that's just one of the many studies demonstrating pretty unambiguously the regressive and often hostile environments in fandoms for marginalized participants, often women. Now, am I trying to conclude that Neil Gaiman in particular developed his sexist, violent attitudes towards women in the seedy basements of 1970s comic fandom London, and that's why he's such an abusive prick? No, who cares? I'm not interested in what lies in Neil Gaiman's heart, and I really don't think you should be either. I'm not interested in finding the real Neil in his work or in interviews or in his public statements defending himself, and I don't think you should be either. Speaking for myself, as the anthropomorphic personification of death, I don't think we should be going on social media or YouTube and either wondering or loudly declaring the kinds of personality disorders or moral shortcomings we think this particular person has. I don't think we should be finding patterns in his past relationships or his choice of wording or speculating on the tells in his books and the way he writes women or whatever. I don't think you need Roland Barthes to tell you that that's getting it exactly backwards. So let's cut to the chase.
Welcome back, everyone. Only Matt has made it through to the final chase.
Death of the author is just one way to do it. It's misunderstood, and I think something gets lost in that misunderstanding. Just how antithetical it is to our contemporary way of thinking about works of media. Just how nosy and obsessed with people's personal lives and mistaken about genius we are. There's a reason I've chosen to refer to the essay The Death of the Author and to use its pronouns of it/its rather than referring to its author, Roland Barthes, and his pronouns of he/his. This is a kind of hack to get your brain to associate a text with its own meaning rather than associating it with a relational meaning between your interpretation of the text and your interpretation of the author. And so instead of thinking, what influence has Neil Gaiman had on me, I can think, what influence have the Sandman comics had on me? Or what influence has American Gods had on me. More importantly, instead of thinking, what sort of a soul could create such a piece of literature, I can think, what is the soul of this piece of literature? Because at this point, I don't want to know anything more about Neil Gaiman and his fucking ugly business. I frankly don't want to bump into him in his books. And I can't bring myself to care about his fucking Blender level setting or whatever. I think because I'm uncomfortable giving him that power. If we really wanted to help women, if we really wanted to prevent the future abuse of vulnerable fans or the future sexual assault of vulnerable young employees, then we should focus on the social forces and measurable phenomena underlying that abuse. Not the particulars of Gaiman's character, but focus instead on making, as Mary Pfeiffer said, rape as unthinkable to young men as cannibalism. In that endeavor, we can look to academic works, another kind of authorless text, for some measurable direction towards the goal of doing away with rape, healing this species of sexual violence. That could be the way that we orient when revelations about Neil Gaiman or whoever come to light. An academic text, good epidemiology, or a good psych paper, or a respectable feminist text, does not rely on the persona of its author to be true or good, and will only be informed by the author's personal life in as much as it might create bias, which is an interesting way to think about death of the author. Perhaps authors can fail to die in their efforts to really write. Just like an academic text can fail to capture objective reality, art can fail to adequately capture subjective reality. An author can inherit some of the worst ugly fictions from out here in the broader world and then not only repeat them, but amplify them. An author can be little more than an interruption to the things that they wanted to say. I think that's a fascinating and open-ended way to think about books and things. But if I were going to talk about all of that, I'd want to do it with a different author, because I'm sick to death of Neil Gaiman. It's a massive part of why this essay is so distracted by the broader picture. A picture of fame and power that inevitably creates hierarchy and particularly corrupts masculinity. One which isn't helped by picking apart the carcass of Neil Gaiman's shortcomings. And this is what I think. Success is fundamentally tied to sexual power over women. By remembering this immutable reality, I may have, strangely enough, found a means by which I can break this bloody parasocial bond that I have with Neil fucking Gaiman. A way to swap one kind of heartbreak for another. Because basically Neil Gaiman is not special. Not as a writer, not as a man, and not as a monster. Neil Gaiman is, at best, a weak-spirited fellow in the face of forces that make sexual assault so fucking normal. And that's the problem.
Did you study Greek tragedy in school? Like read Antigone or Medea or Oedipus Rex? If so, you might have gone over some of Aristotle and his analysis of the tragic hero. This is the protagonist of the story who is supposed to have certain characteristics, like they have to be in a position of power or status because then they have something to lose, and they have to have some sort of tragic flaw, their Achilles heel. A tragedy often invokes a strong message about fate and inevitability. Oedipus hears he's going to kill his father and marry his mother, so he runs away, never to see them again, killing a random man and marrying a queen, only to find out later that he was in fact adopted, and by attempting to run from his fate, he sealed it. Aristotle believed that watching plays is good for us. It helps us experience feelings of pity and fear, and purging those feelings fulfills a social function. Sometimes I wonder if we're doing something similar when we collectively process a celebrity's downfall. So there are two concepts here that I find useful. The first is affective disposition theory, the second is moral capital. Affective disposition theory is one of those psych theories that you may be just tempted to call common sense, but a lot of our common sense beliefs aren't actually true, so it's always good to have a tested theory to point to. This one says that when we engage with a TV show, for example, we make moral judgments of the characters involved, and we like when good things happen to the good guys, and we like when bad things happen to the bad guys. It gets more complicated, obviously. The amount of empathy we have for a character's circumstances plays a role in whether we see them as good or bad, and our perception of characters change as we learn more information. But in this case, it's basically an explanation for Schadenfreude. It's nice seeing bad people get punished. Moral capital is slightly more complicated. Expanding on Bourdieu's cultural capital, moral capital describes how our social standing, our clout, our wasta, can change based on how moral we appear to other people. That's not our actual morality. Morality is a personal system of rules that other people can't really see we're following. This is explicitly the morality that we signal. It's virtue signaling as a real academic concept rather than just a racist dog whistle. So, if we see a celebrity as a commodity or a character, which is how many of us interact with them, then these two forces might come into play when this celebrity commits a transgression. Obviously, some people are going to be genuinely upset, hurt, and invested, but other people have an opportunity to improve their moral capital by loudly calling out. Apologize about Angel Buck already. By loudly condemning an influencer, we're saying we're not on team, infidelity or buying an expensive house or team sexual assault. I'm not saying this is done cynically. It can feel destabilizing to see someone you admire committing a moral transgression. And if you're saying something about it, even just on your own Blue Sky feed, then it can give you some amount of relief. But it's also good to look at why Twitter mobs develop, to recognize that it can be fun to join in on condemning an influencer, even if you didn't know who they were before hearing that they'd done something wrong. It scratches the itch we feel in wanting villains to suffer, and it raises our social status with like-minded people. This is why so many of these cancellations are actually nothing like Greek tragedies, because the catharsis we feel in watching a villain get their due, that's not what Aristotle coined the term catharsis for. The Greek tragic hero is moral, deontologically and rigidly so. It's their principles that get them into trouble, and their inability to morally compromise that seals their fall from grace. Aristotle's catharsis relies on us having empathy and experiencing pity, and that's not what happened with Neil Gaiman.
He read me a poem once. Neil Gaiman, I mean. He read a lot of people the poem. It was a big room with a lot of people in the room, and he was on the stage part of the room. But still, look at me, name-dropping Neil Gaiman, the rapist. So that was at an Amanda Palmer gig, which was this formative experience for me. I was on a date there, in a fervent queer relationship, not long out of the closet. And Amanda Palmer had come to Dublin to sing for everybody the same week that Ireland legalised abortion. It was the famous repealing of the Eighth Amendment week. Irish feminists will remember where they were. And Neil Gaiman, who was married to Palmer at the time, was also in Dublin for the launch of a new book or something, I believe. And there were whispers that perhaps he might make an appearance at this gig. He did. He came out and he read a poem about how the first scientists in our species were women, who tested which mushrooms needed to be cooked and who made slings for their babies to keep their arms free. It's actually a pretty good poem, but I'm done quoting Gaiman. When he finished, Palmer leaned playfully into her microphone so that her voice was comically loud, and she said, "Good feminist." That was his image, wasn't it? Not just a guy, not just a nice guy, but a feminist, a proper champion for women and for marginalized people. He famously defended the inclusion of a trans woman character in the Sandman novels. He's had public spats with TERFs. He identifies as a feminist. He walked out on that stage, and as silly as it is, I got excited chills and a heart-pounding feeling of something cool happening. Yes, it was in large part because of an exciting chapter in my life and a righteous part of Ireland's history and a genuinely very good gig. But it was also because he came to join us in that moment. Like, important things were happening and an important person was joining us and conferring importance on this moment. He was someone with an apparent fortune in moral capital. And in order for someone to fall from grace, they have to be in possession of grace in the first place. There has to be at least some morality and dignity for them to lose. People like Andrew Tate or Matt Walsh don't have that standard that they're held to. Even edgy comedians like Ricky Gervais or Bill Maher start out much more morally ambivalent. And so they can say, I get cancelled all the time, because they never really get cancelled. Occasionally, like with Tate or his brother or with Conor McGregor, they might get prosecuted to whatever extent, but few, if any, of their fandom will break up with them. Their persona is consistent with their wrongdoing. They're famous because they're monsters. This is summed up in something called expectancy violations theory. Relationships are damaged when someone violates a moral expectation. See, whether or not a relationship is parasocial It's always based on your expectation of someone. I thought Neil Gaiman was a good feminist. His wife said so. These expectations we have may offer some explanation for our disbelief when a celebrity does something bad. Our expectations of the character of someone we know and love may even be part of why we sometimes mount premature defenses of them. They would never do that. This must be a cash grab, false accusation, or fake news, or a psyop. You see, unlike a Greek tragedy or most forms of narrative that we actually enjoy, the fall from grace of a celebrity can never be that of a tragic hero. They're not a hero. They're not fated to exemplify some absolute moral trait or some absolute character trait. They're not so very much themselves that they face destruction because of it. No. The only way a celebrity can fall from grace is if they fail to be who we think they are. Unfortunately, we all thought Neil Gaiman was unbelievably cool and quite moral and generally very sound and a good guy. Part of the reason this hurts so much is that yet another good guy turned out to be anything but, and there's no catharsis in that. It's not good storytelling. So we scrabble around trying to find a pattern on some higher order of things. Maybe they're made up allegations, or maybe Neil Gaiman must have actually been a dickhead all along, or maybe I never even really liked those books as much as I thought I did. Maybe, narrative, dissonance.
It's appealing to think that we're smarter than the other people around us, that we're more likely to sniff out the fakes and pretenders. We see this every time there's a cancellation. All of the people coming out of the woodwork saying, I knew all along that Joe Jonesteen was toxic. And hey, I get it. I've always hated J.K. Rowling. I wrote an editorial for my high school newspaper where I called her a bad writer. I didn't spot that she'd become a prominent anti-feminist hate monger, but the bad writing I did. And it felt a little perversely validating when someone who I hated turned out to have been a bad person. So I'm no better here. I have participated in this phenomenon. But, stick with me, a lot of that feeling of I knew it is probably based on coincidence. As humans, we're actually really bad at sussing out liars. This is a bugbear of mine because it's clearly something we want to be good at. It's a staple of daytime TV shows for a reason. The body language expert, the micro-expressions expert, the whatever pseudoscience is popular at the moment expert. But none of them are any good at it either. We all know by now that polygraph machines are bullshit. And it seems like fMRI methods of catching deception are laden with the same sorts of problems. In studies of deception, differences between liars and truth tellers are inconsistent and very faint. So a finding that, for example, someone lying might make slightly fewer hand movements than someone telling the truth, well, that only gets you somewhere if you're incredibly aware of the average amount of hand movements that people make. To be able to tell if somebody's lying based on hand gestures, you'd have to be like counting their hand gestures like you were in a lab in normal conditions. And then they'd have to murder somebody. And then that's when you'd have to be like, let's see if when you're trying to defend yourself, you use fewer or more hand gestures.
In John Grisham's The Gesturer.
This is the example an article I read used when making the case that police guidelines on catching liars are actually really misleading. And factor into this that liars might take countermeasures to make themselves seem more believable, or that we find people experiencing anxiety less believable, and it all kind of falls apart. We can't see if someone is lying to us by looking at their voices, faces, bodies, or brains. In fact, when we trust our intuition, we're actually setting ourselves up to fall afoul of social biases like racism or sexism or classism or ableism. Besides, thinking we're good at reading vibes is kind of victim blamey. Sure, the guy who punches holes in walls at parties is probably not a great guy, but the really charming one who tells interesting stories and is a good listener, that guy isn't necessarily safe. Ask people leaving abusive partners if they saw any red flags early on. Some obviously did, but a ton of others didn't. And it's not because they're particularly bad judges of character, but because a lot of abusive people are really good at impression management, at being charming, at being really in control of themselves in situations where that's socially advantageous. A lot of people leaving abusive partners are going to be met with disbelief because often the most abusive people seem really great. That's kind of the way they're able to do what they do. Abusive people are essentially really good liars. But knowing that isn't satisfying. If you've been hurt by someone, if you've been deceived, it's not very cathartic to hear, well, this could happen to anyone. None of us is very good at this. So you might start trying to come up with your own way of sussing out who the bad guys are ahead of time. I see this a lot on Twitter or in the comment sections of my own or my friends' videos. People saying things like, is that thumbnail AI art? Because that would mean you're lying about the whole anti-capitalist thing. Or, so-and-so pronounced that word incorrectly? That might be a tell that they're being paid off. Or, I don't know, calling things psyops? I see a lot of people calling things psyops. Or one YouTuber is getting canceled for legitimate reasons and a bunch of people start listing other unconnected YouTubers by being like, I can't wait for this to happen to X next. And it's like, you can't wait to find out there's someone else who got assaulted by a different YouTuber? Like, what? I found these comments gross. But I'm trying to tell myself that what I'm seeing isn't people necessarily delighting in other people's downfall, but a kind of paranoia that develops in this environment where we've been made to feel as if we're responsible for preventing ourselves from being victimized. Finding out that a creator we love has done something bad doesn't just hurt, but because we're identified with the creator, we start to feel like it's an indictment of ourselves, and that really hurts. I think the urge to suss out the phonies is a way of trying to protect ourselves. I just don't think it's very effective. The people who are good liars are usually really aware of how to market themselves as safe and wholesome. All the looking for tells does is create an unpleasant environment. It doesn't mean you're going to avoid loving another abusive creator. Bad actors are the ones at fault for their actions. It's not the fault of people who trusted them or who loved them or were engaged with their work. And it's not an indictment of your judgment being bad if you've been hurt by one of them. That's just human. If they've taken advantage of your trust to hurt you or to hurt others, then hey, that's just one more way that they've been awful. All right, do I get to go back to bed now?
Go to bed. Go to bed.
Okay. I do not know how pregnancy doesn't radicalize more people.
I actually have mixed feelings about parasocial relationships. Like I said towards the start, we all have some manner of online existence and as a result, a persona. A lot of us are networked, like not in a cynical business-like way, but in a social way, with people who make the culture by sharing in its interests and people who make the culture by making things.
When you put your hands up because you put them in front of you, they suddenly were like really in the like kind of scary.
But okay, I'll pick up that thread in a second. First, I want to start pulling together some of these other threads because fuck Neil Gaiman, but now in the sense that all of this is much bigger than him. All the research on fandom communities and theorizing about cultural, social, moral capital and so on is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of understanding how modern culture organizes itself. This phenomenon of learning how to be people from Star Trek, from comic books, from Hollywood, from comedians, from fantasy novels, and now from YouTube is generations deep. You are on social media following a bunch of your heroes and or you're in a Discord community for a thing you're interested in and or you're interacting with various cultural objects that make up your taste and therefore your identity, and definitely you are the target of algorithms that have already concluded your relationships to those cultural objects anyway. You are a fan whether you know it or not. That is the way society is organized now. Of course it is. Fans are consumers. Consumers are fans. And like misogyny and fandom, the connection between fandom and consumerism is really well established in the academic literature on the subject. But there's something more that I'd like to add to that. This fandom normativity, if you want to call it that, composes our understanding of ourselves much more so than some other ideas that get more press, like neoliberalism or postmodernism or whatever. Like the prevailing image of the modern Western hegemonic person is one who's alienated by capitalism and the internet age, right? Who thinks that individualism and rational ideals from the Enlightenment are just like normal things, who was born long after Nietzsche declared God is dead and we have killed him, who inherits postmodernity and the surveillance state and all of that bollocks, right? But my suspicion is that we can't perceive those things about ourselves very well. What we can perceive about ourselves is our taste. Our self-image is arrived at by way of what we like and what we don't like, and what we think liking and not liking certain things says about us. All of that, what we like and what we don't like and what we think it says about us, is how we understand our relationship to this dystopia that we live in too. It is both illuminating and more than a little horrifying, because yeah, that last vestige of freedom that you think you have to read a book or listen to some music or even like the way that someone tweets forms the strongest bond between you and this capitalist construct. You are attached to the continued output of Neil Gaiman, or the MCU, or the leftist fucking cooks. It is telling that the thing they threaten you with in anti-USSR propaganda is a grey, homogenous, unentertaining, colourless, cultureless dull. Or in anti-North Korean propaganda, the threat is state control of a wildly uncool and impossible to interpret media landscape. Like they're just shy of saying, without capitalism, there'd be no fun. There'd be no Hollywood, there'd be no book signings, there'd be no Hot Ones, there'd be no Saturday morning cartoons or Saturday Night Live or Saturdays. And the only celebrities would be politicians with big mustaches who slowly disappear from photographs. Is that what you want? Communists. Of course, this is not a threat I want to replicate. It's not my idea of utopia, quite apart from debunking its complete falseness. It's also not a way I want to think about celebrity. I think there is at least one very unnecessary and tenuous connection being made there between these disgustingly wealthy and powerful and culturally ubiquitous creators of fun, the stars, and the colour and art and fandom and community and fervour we want to have in our lives, and that we have a right to have in our lives. Just testing those vibes again here, but yep, they're definitely, you know, vibes. There definitely seems to be something in the air calling us back to those basements in 1970s London, to smaller and more personal fandoms where tens of avid comic book readers might gather to tell one baffled penciler that his art is very important. I don't mean literally a call to any basement in particular, but rather a shared genre-fluid rejection of ubiquitous consumer fandom and a return to community arranged around creativity and shared weirdness. I would include in this the call to return to Web 1.5 sensibilities that I've seen from CJ the X, Chris Waves, and others, which I think is our generation's nostalgia for basement fandom. All of this reminds me of small-scale music scenes, from my own experience and from stories of dubstep at its creative peak, or punk back when it was punk. From my perspective, playing music and going to gigs and working with different musicians and getting to know heads from the scene was the joyful part, and the part that sucked was the neuroses of trying to succeed, the conflicting needs of creativity and commerciality. I could talk about small-scale comedy gigs in Dublin. I could talk about poetry nights in Limerick. And what's cool is I'm sure many of you could talk about your own weird scenes in your own weird little cities, as fans and as creatives, or as both. So when I say I have mixed feelings about parasocial relationships specifically, it's because I find this scene, the video essay scene, the most cool and exciting artistic medium happening right now. And I believe that part of the reason it's so cool and exciting has to do with how much of a response it is to all of the things we've spoken about in this video. It's a development of nerd culture. Look at all the video essays about comic book movies and anime and video games and books. It's a basement culture. You still have to explain to people what a video essay even is. It is a parallel culture concerned at its core with not repeating the prejudices of mainstream society, so it's an interesting scene in which to learn to be a person. It's massively creative in that most authentic and exciting of ways, in the sense that none of us have any idea how video essays work and we're still making up how they even go. And most important of all, the audience is right here, right up in our business, speaking back to us. The audience has more power than in almost any other media, and there's data on this. A consensus is growing that there are unique components to parasocial relationships with YouTubers and streamers specifically. One study I found shows how parasocial relationships with Twitch streamers and relationships with their communities can be both beneficial and potentially harmful when it comes to navigating difficult parts of our lives specifically. On the one side, streams offer distraction, pleasure, relatedness to others, and online anonymity can help people to open up. But on the other side, the study showed that trolling and memes can also stop people from opening up.
Several people, due to their depression or anxiety, stated it was impossible for them to build and maintain these real-world relationships. For these people, Twitch was a way to have at least some form of social connection. In addition, the participants in our study seemed well aware of the difference between the virtual and the real world, and the one-sided nature of the relationship between themselves and the streamer.
But another study went even further and framed parasocial relationships with streamers in particular as 1.5-sided. That is,
characterized by the potential for reciprocal communication, strong community affiliation, fandom cultures, wishful identification, high emotional engagement, and increased presence.
the fact that something they say can send the streamer off to go look something up and better themselves, all leads to a dissolving of the boundaries between parasocial and social in this medium and media like it. I'll re-emphasize, when I say that there's more accountability in this scene, I don't mean to promote the sort of atmosphere where we patrol YouTubers and streamers.
Apologize about Angel Buck already.
On the lookout for the secretly abusive or the secretly fasci or the secretly transmedicalist or the secretly working for the Kremlin. I mean, the YouTubers getting paid by Russia aren't exactly doing a great job of hiding it. But in fact-checking and bouncing back and forth ideas and sharing academic resources and participating in mutual aid, and by positively encouraging the better part of ethical living, saying, hey, your work has helped me to be a better person. Audiences of streamers and political YouTubers have adopted an interesting role, one which might have baffled Roland Barthes. They are part of the art, part of a symphony of voices in which the streamer or the YouTuber is no longer the sole author. They also die in committing their voices to the creation. And by the way, I do think that live streaming on Twitch is art. I don't get this whole that's not real art argument for everything. Art is cheap, art is abundant, art is everywhere. I think lots of online media gets unfairly maligned as content, but it is art. And we're allowed to say that. Be proud of your basement culture. I've noticed that when Sarah tells me she's seen something on TikTok, she'll be like, I heard from an antenatal clinician on TikTok. And I'm like, don't be ashamed. Don't say on TikTok. Like, she's a qualified OBGYN and I know you watch TikTok. Don't worry, I love you. Another important structural difference between this kind of parasocial relationship and the kind of parasocial relationship that I used to have with Neil Gaiman before we broke up is where the money comes from. Basically, bottom-up revenue versus revenue from a media outlet. Now, I know that on the one hand, Neil Gaiman's fans pay his bills. They buy his books and they watch his adaptations. I also know that streamers and YouTubers come in all kinds of sizes and they make money from ad revenue from ads hosted on sites like YouTube, which is owned by Google, and Twitch, which is owned by Amazon. But there is a top-down component to Gaiman. He has a very well-paid agent, he publishes with the biggest publishers, the money all goes to a big pot, and he gets paid very handsomely. Gaiman has readers. He has subjects, in a way. He is elevated above them in the capitalist system, and they purchase entertainment from him. This is why I actually don't think the answer lies, as Alan Moore hints, in creators becoming recluses in their respective mansions. Whereas in the small to medium creator economy, we're completely immersed. We're all fans together. The audience is right here, and our community is the thing that actually supports us financially. The thing that we focus on, Sarah and I, is Patreon. And with something like Patreon, you have a bottom-up source of revenue. We are concerned with the fan base in the basement, getting excited about the latest video and speaking to us quite directly, on our Patreon or in our Discord or in the comments. And mostly, people don't use that as a way to force us to do anything. Very few people, if anyone, has ever used Patreon or money to force a parasocial interaction with us. Mostly, people just care about art and about truth and about video essays getting the chance to exist. They're true fans of a medium, of an idea. And if you're like, oh, well, this is a pretty good video, then you owe a debt of gratitude to the people who support us on Patreon. You could be one of them, if you like, but if you can't afford to, don't worry, because some very cool people, some video essay nerds, have got your back. So yeah, the ability of someone like Neil Gaiman to abuse their power is intrinsically related to that top-down relationship with the rest of us. It's just not the same thing as Lumi Roo, for example, having a community of people and genuinely in good faith trying to be a good influence on them.
Oh my gosh, thank you.
With the greatest respect, who's even fucking heard of Lumi Roo?
Well,
They're not a celebrity, but they are nevertheless a cultural object for a community, and their intentions by way of their community would seem to be very sincere. It is my opinion that we shouldn't run away from or be disgusted by this idea of parasocial relationships, but instead we need to disentangle that idea from rising in the hierarchy of society. If we take social attachments to people we don't actually know as some inevitable part of a world where books and the internet exist, then we should be very smart about what we run away from and try to abolish. Perhaps the only socially acceptable parasocial relationships should be 1.5-sided. And if we examine power as opposed to fame, the poison of patriarchy, the poison of wealth, the poison of authority, the poison of being bigger and more important than other people, we find that its evil is fundamentally tied to owning women sexually. The whole way that society is structured is that the elevated, prestigious positions are defined by sexual entitlement to people who are less important than you. It's not defined by jewels and cars and mansions. There are many ways to perform wealth, and nouvelle riche people get laughed at by old money for the gauche ways that they dress themselves in riches. And it's not defined by fame. There are lots of very important people who are very powerful that you've never heard of, and they like it that way. But the sort of power that Neil Gaiman took advantage of, to use, hurt, ejaculate on, and silence women, is baked into power as we understand it here in this fucking dystopia. It just is. It is always dangerous when we make men powerful. Oh, that's the timestamp. That's the time. So the people who just skipped the entire essay, they just joined us like 30 seconds ago. Yeah, so that's it. Neil Gaiman is not special. He's not even interesting. Sexually assaulting people is one of the most foundational ways of demonstrating that you've won capitalism. People do it when they're at the top because they can, and people emulate it when they're not at the top because they want to feel like they are at the top. We need to deconstruct the whole celebrity, fame, power, structure thing. If you'd seen the rest of the video, you'd have a better idea of how I would propose to do that, or at least you'd have a better idea of what we could do instead. But whatever, time's a wasting. You've got to watch some videos about that new big prime number they found and some Simpsons retrospectives or whatever. So let's get on with the conclusion. Even your taste moves on from heartbreak. You might harbor that feeling for a while of wanting to get back with your ex, but they've changed and you've changed, and even kissing won't be what it was because your lips have changed. So I find it hard to read Neil Gaiman, honestly. He seems kind of crap now, and mediocre and commercial and obvious and So do a lot of things, honestly. Apparently the Good Omens TV show has totally disavowed him for season 3, but I still don't feel like I was going to be missing out on much by skipping it, and so I think I still might. I tried to read Neil Gaiman and he wasn't all that, so then I tried to watch TV and it was also just garbage. What is SEAL Team? Why are there 3 seasons of SEAL Team? Right now, with celebrities cheerleading genocide and stepping in line behind a fascist America, I just can't handle being presented all these tank-riding, gun-shooting, beauty standards, land of the free, commenting on the land of the free things. So I turned it off and I did nothing. I did nothing and it was great. I felt like I won't miss celebrities. I won't miss Neil Gaiman. And for the record, I'm not saying that there's a magical ethical world instead over here of better writers and creatives who would never harm anyone, and it just happens to be that they're video essayists and streamers who just happen to be my friends. Because there's no real structural reason why a novelist or an actor would be any more dangerous. In fact, I know unambiguously that video essayists and streamers are capable of sexual assault. See, there's what you can turn your anger towards. There's changing the world. That's why we make Neil Gaiman a pariah. Because what he did should be unthinkable. Because the pain that it activates in you is real. Because we can and should imagine a better world. Because you don't just get to keep being beloved, Neil. No, fuck off. You're out. You're not a hero, Neil. You're a fucking loser. And that's what we do with our anger. What we do with our love is something else. That's where I'm trying to encourage you to read a better book, a more challenging book, to turn off the screen and listen to some music. What we might do with our love left over and burned by yet another failed cultural object is to be excited about it, be open-minded, and slut that love around. Go to a poetry reading, go to a small gig, find a great video essay, find a new novel and know nothing about the persona of its author. Or just turn YouTube off and do nothing. Just do nothing. I'm here singing the praises of video essays, and that's only partly because I want to shake up our conception of parasocial dynamics. It's mostly because I'm excited about new stuff that we could all fall in love with. The art I'm most excited about lies beyond the event horizon of the collapse of capitalism. Right now, at this horrible late stage, I'm just not interested in the stuff that capitalism produces to show off how dazzling capitalism is. It's empty and it's crap and it's disgusting. I don't like Agatha all along. I don't care for Deadpool and Wolverine, and I'm not going to watch Captain America 4. I don't want to participate in this slop culture. Like, if I have to be alive at this point in time, I want to at least have some say in the quality of beautiful things I consume. I don't have much control over anything else. We need to be able to imagine what a post-celebrity world might look like. I might not have done a very good job with that or explaining why we need to, but we do. We need to imagine what to do with ourselves as geeks and queer people and neurodivergent and obsessive bookish fandom types, because we're wasting our fucking time trying to squeeze beauty out of Neil Gaiman. So that's your homework. Imagine a post-celebrity society. Find some new stuff somewhere. Go tell someone who never hears about their art that they're fucking amazing and that their art matters. There's a bit of manic euphoria that sets in at a certain point after a breakup, when you feel like you've got you back and you have so much you that you want to be and that you want to go show off. Well, maybe we should break up with not just Neil Gaiman, but the majority of contemporary media. We could do that knowing, yes, there'll be a sad bit, a terribly sad bit, but then afterwards there'll be a bit where we're really happy and we're excited about all the new ways we can enjoy ourselves and that we don't have to keep doing the same thing. I mean, we kind of already are, right? There's something in the air. Mass media is in decline. We shouldn't be trying to resuscitate it. It is likely on this long road of life that you will eventually read a novel that is so wonderful it makes you think, who could you have been to feel this way about Neil Gaiman? And I hope that for you, that moment is a long way off, because in the meantime, there's so much exciting, weird, cool, and perhaps not even yet created shit for you to get your teeth into. And a whole lot of doing nothing except imagining that you have to do as well.
NB monkey space monkey muck punk D Mark blank Amy Tankersley Paul Offler na meow me Nick Julie Go Lick Manuel Frick Infinite Slick Timothy Hicks Sean McCormick Nick P Zark Narc Sidekick Fred Brennan Sam Chapman Ben Crana Yandaluk Tristan Holderness Thorna Kumsindian. I'm not telling you Diggleworth Chris Noon Harry McTighe Smokey McBongwater. Bigger, Gayer Magic 1993, Patreon supporter Jesse Reeves, Dysregulated and E. Shah, Pearl My Terriot Savile Hayes, Lemonade 1947, The Malevolent Weasel, Moon on Her Wings, Mary Mings, Ash Hutchings, Alex Nebling, Han Ming Chen, Misling, Lene, Queen of Spring, Violet Cyberspace, What's Her Face, Jace Almanza, Mariana Hernandez, Leona Grace, Lacey Eberl, Tom Foss, Aaron Khan, Nareen, Ariane, Nagaro, Shai, and Luna Abadadian, Jan, Fora, Dory, Muddle, Wait, Onion, Lori, Joe, Natalia Romaro, Chris Wallman, and Toria. Patreon limits usernames to 72 characters, but is that an Spingus and Mingo, Gwendol versus Everything, and Max Dupinois, Spider, Flash, and Sleepwalk. Pranaya Alterio, Pika Pika Lucio, Alendia Warner 137 Milo, Esoteric Fictionalism, SBC Veganartism, Diana Gibson, Rob Robinson, Reed Davidson, Alan McPherson Moe, No, Faust, Authentistic Corntastic Guy, Bombastian, Joel Jansen, Pie, Bye. That's enough. You're all loved. Bye.
Bye.